I'm Roger Heacock, professor of history in the Ibrahim Abouloughed Institute of International Studies at EACEA University, and in the PhD program in social sciences at the same university. And I shall now begin my lecture. And I have titled it, "The EU and the Middle East, Promoting Democracy Light." First of all, a word on method. This presentation is going to be based on history, geography, and geopolitics. Where history is concerned, I shall not hesitate to go back even to a period in which the current European Union was not yet the slightest dream. But I shall more specifically speak of the direct roots and historical motivations for the creation and development of the EU. And these are key to understanding all of its actions in the world today, including, of course, but not limited to, democracy promotion. We are speaking of what is known as contemporary history on the one hand, over the past 100 years, and the history of the present, in French, Histoire du temps présent, in German, Gegenwartsgeschichte, Tarikh al-Hadar. It will not contain much by way of presentation of institutions and administration, except towards the end with our case study. These institutional matters are important, but others have spoken about them, and they are easily available in many texts. I think my contribution lies elsewhere, in analyzing profounder forces which determine and sometimes overdetermine today's events. Democracy promotion in the greater Middle East is rather a contradiction in terms nowadays. 11 years after the great Arab revolutions of 2011 made it for a short time, for a short while, appear as a universal hope, democracy. And for some countries, such as Tunisia, Egypt, but also Yemen, Libya, the Maghreb countries, a distinct possibility, even in the short or medium term. But more surprising is perhaps the reaction of the European Union to those events. It did little to encourage the advance of the democratic awakening in those countries, whereas the Obama administration, for example, moved for a while to support and consolidate the democratic process in Egypt and Tunisia. Various EU countries did all they could to hold it up. And the EU as an institution appeared thus paralyzed by internal division and the fear of revolution elsewhere. Of course, nowhere was this fear as clearly expressed as in Russia, since Putin condemned popular movements anywhere and everywhere as needing to be put down as quickly as possible. Because, as he stated at the time, or as he stated time and again, the Russian Revolution of 1917 had shown how disastrous were the effects of revolution. And he proceeded to help in stopping the progression of the Arab uprisings wherever he could. Most notably, of course, in Syria. With this backdrop to our discussion of the EU and democracy promotion, let us proceed with an in-depth analysis, first of all, of EU foreign policy in general, and in particular, democracy promotion outside the Union. And then the perspective from the Middle East, most particularly Palestine. This requires an understanding of the nature of the European Union based on history and its deep commitments, strictures, and of course, structures. The movement for European unity is an old one, going back to the 9th century with the coronation of Charlemagne as Emperor of the West in the year 800. At that time, he had consolidated his rule in Central and Western Europe and launched a very early form of European integration in what is today France, Western Germany, Northern Italy, and areas belonging to the Netherlands and Belgium. With help from the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, Charlemagne managed to put something together in those areas which showed promise as a unified territorial proto-state. But of course, after his death, his children and grandchildren fought over the land, and it was divided up between them. The division lasted over the centuries, but not without attempts by various parties to unite this part of Europe. Two things characterized these successive attempts. One, they were carried out by force. And two, they failed. They failed at the cost, sometimes, a huge cost by way of economic and, more importantly, human losses of lives counted in the millions. The examples are well known and they cover the centuries since the Middle Ages. Habsburg Empire, France, especially Napoleon, Britain in the 19th century through naval power, and of course, Germany from 1870 to 1945. During this period, it can't be said that nothing was done by way of European and beyond worldwide integration and coordination. International, governmental, and non-governmental organizations and regimes of particular relevance in some cases were built throughout the 19th and early 20th century. Of perhaps greatest note are the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 and the International Committee of the Red Cross. But diplomatic, state-led moves such as the alliance system and arms races and agreements and treaties only serve to hasten the onset of war, not to avoid it. When Europe awoke from the nightmare of 1945, it was devastated in human, but also in political terms. Political systems had to be rebuilt from the bottom up, even in the United Kingdom, where the victory of Labour in 1945 coincided with the programmed loss of the empire and the compensatory construction of a social welfare system. And Europe, East and West, was surrounded by the main protagonists in the Cold War who monopolized international politics, the US and the USSR, the Soviet Union. And so the Europeans really had no choice. They woke up to the fact that they needed to rebuild in a novel manner from the bottom up, and crucially, in terms of what we are discussing, from the inside out. Ever since European construction began in earnest around 1951, the focus was inward, not outwards. And so spreading democracy was a domestic, a European concern, and never a primary foreign policy objective. Meantime, for the two great protagonists in the Cold War, it was the reverse. Each of them was pushing its social and political model vigorously all over the world, even as their own peoples were subject to repressive policies of various types, Stalinism, McCarthyism, and so on. Europe, for its part, was rebuilding its democracy, country by country. And as the process ended, with the perspective also of the end of the terrible era of colonial rule by the European states, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Britain, and denazification having taken root in Western Germany, the time was judged ripe to consolidate and share democratic governance across their mutual borders. This experiment, begun in earnest with the Treaty of Rome in 1957, had been initiated previously in the industrial field with the European coal and steel community, successfully and unsuccessfully. The memory of World War II still too fresh in the military field. Now was the turn of politics, and the 6 signatories in the preamble to the Treaty of Rome stated that they were, quote, determined to lay the foundations of an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. And further on, quote, anxious to strengthen the unity of their economies and to ensure their harmonious development by reducing the differences existing between the various regions and the backwardness of the less favored regions, all of which was to precede their call to, quote, call to the, quote, the other peoples of Europe who share their ideal to join in their efforts. True, the first sentence includes all Europe, not just the 6, and hence only Europe. De Gaulle, for example, called for Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals even. But the priority remained and remains today the inner cohesion of the group. Now, to the Middle East. Needless to say, problems arose regarding relations with the Middle East as soon as the common market was formed, 1957-58. One was temporary, Algeria. France was engaged in trying to put down the Algerian Revolution and would not countenance the establishment of normal relations with countries in the region, most of which supported the insurgents. That problem was finally solved in 1962 when Algeria became independent, and de Gaulle immediately declared solidarity with the Third World. The second problem was the Arab-Israeli conflict, and this one proved long-lasting. Even the original 6 could not speak with one voice. The Netherlands, in particular, remained close friends and supporters of Israel, for which they were subject to the oil embargo in 1973, while France suddenly found itself to be the best friend of the Arabs, one of the many ironies of history. And of course, Germany has always held the position that it would not oppose Israel under any circumstances. It would at best remain silent. And so from early on, we can see the double obstacle to carrying out consistent policies abroad in general, and in the Middle East in particular. One, the joint emphasis is always on internal construction, never on external policy. Two, European countries have always had and will always continue to have differences in policies, small or large. And now that they are 27, more than ever. And this applies most particularly to the Middle East for reasons of history, identity, and economic interest. Indeed, perceived self-interest is much more varied now, and often there are contradictions, as seen between Eastern Europe, including increasingly Austria, and Southern Europe. Certain initiatives did get off the ground, but they concerned part of Europe, such as the Mediterranean states and part of the Arab world, notably the Maghreb states. But these arrangements have not proven very successful. The basic reason is that the respective priorities are very different. For Europe, the non-European neighborhood policy was intended to maximize one, security, European security. Two, investment. And three, control of migration. These three objectives are obviously linked, since maximizing each of them reinforces the two others. Migration to Europe, it is thought, would be lessened if there were economic opportunities in the southern Mediterranean states. These opportunities would, it was argued, be maximized through investments in the economies of the South. Of course, this would coincidentally serve European economic interests as well. And the argument runs, insecurity is caused when young people have lost hope because of economic problems, particularly unemployment. The areas of notable interest to the southern Mediterranean states were, on the other hand, possibilities for sending surplus and thus potentially dangerous labor forces north to Europe. And most of all, measures in the military, the economic, and other fields for strengthening the regimes in place. The last element, of course, contradicted any program for strengthening democracy, needless to say. Virtually all of the southern Mediterranean states, and notably the Arab ones, and the Middle East in general, have been for the past half century, and despite the revolutions of 2011, put down one after the other, most emphatically, and despite the Arab revolutions of 2011, which were put down one after the other. And these states most emphatically continue to be authoritarian regimes with no interest in democracy promotion beyond sloganeering and with heavy repression of political opposition and ethnic minorities. Decisive, but rather brief change came following the Palestinian Intifada of 1987 and the Oslo Accords, which led many in Europe and also in the Middle East, to think that peace between the Arabs and Israel might be coming sooner than predicted with the creation of a Palestinian state. Europe organized the Barcelona Conference in 1995 and initiated the eponymous Barcelona process, which was intended to consolidate the presumed end of belligerence and the coming of a new Middle East. Many, and today it is largely forgotten how many, anticipated in the mid-1990s that there would be a Palestinian state, the end of belligerency, and Shimon Peres's new Middle East. In other words, cooperation, peace, human rights, democracy, well-being. This remarkable and largely forgotten period saw enormous amounts being spent by Brussels on common projects. The Barcelona period lasted approximately 5 years until the outbreak of the Second Palestinian Intifada. We know now what few knew then, that Israel had not the slightest intention of allowing an independent Palestinian state to be established, and was hell-bent on continuing with its project of colonization and annexation. Ever since the year 2000, in other words, disillusionment has set in where democracy promotion is concerned, with the exception, once again, of a short period of a year or 18 months after the outbreak, or 2 years after the outbreak of the Arab revolutions of 2011. And in the Middle East, the idea that Europe represented a true state building exercise in the sense of a confederation faded rapidly. True, there is in the Middle East still some admiration for the way in which the Union was founded and gradually developed from the bottom up, as it were. And it is always favorably compared and seen as a model for, compared to the League of Arab States, the Arab League, which was from the beginning a tool in the hands of and in the service of particular regimes. First, Great Britain, of course, and in subsequent decades, particular combinations of states, usually centered around Egypt, but not always. Students in the Middle East are interested in studying the model as an example from which to borrow. But public opinion in the Middle East in general is nowadays more impressed by the Russian and Chinese examples. The one based on its very realistic, hard-nosed foreign policy posture, as proven in Syria and elsewhere. The other because of the generally popular economic strategies that China deploys. And note that neither of these two great states has the slightest, but not the slightest, interest in democracy promotion. The EU, in other words, is seen as a kind of teacher in the fields of democracy, human rights, law, and to a certain extent, administration, notably with regard to fighting corruption. but it is seen as a remote teacher whose lessons are not directly relevant to the world as it is. Stalin's famous rhetorical question at the Tehran conference in 1943, how many divisions does the Pope have, is seen to apply here by Middle Easterns. How many divisions then does Europe have? The answer, of course, is zero. Emmanuel Macron's constantly stated wishes to the contrary. Of course, given the progressive withdrawal of the US from the Middle East, Moscow internationally and Turkey and Iran regionally may be the only ones with significant numbers of divisions in the field, all of which makes democracy appear a secondary concern in the region, if that. This is all the more true as Israel is the other actor with numerous divisions in the Middle East. And its magnetic power over the Arab states, but not Arab public opinion. There is a deep chasm between these two, testifies to that fact. Middle Eastern regimes are most interested in economic and security opportunities which Israel's rapprochement with their leaders might offer. In other words, both the peoples and the regimes of the Middle East, particularly the Arab states, are attracted to economic advantages appearing to be on offer by Israel. And governments, Middle Eastern governments, also vie for security systems and indeed military support on offer by Israel locally. Europe, with its social and economic offer, is much less attractive, especially to the regimes, which see in this combination, socio-economic, a distinct threat because patently in the social field broadly defined, including personal and social freedoms, not to speak of political participation, the formula could be fatal for them. This brings us to the question of what we mean when speaking of the Middle East. There is not one country in the region that does not exist in a dual world with a deep split between governments, regimes of closed systems, and peoples. How to measure this allegation? Of course, one could say the same of every country in the world, but the way to decide to what extent it is true is by estimating the portion of lethal force directed against foreign objectives on the one hand, and on the other hand, against one's own people, outside versus inside. In the Middle East, the balance is lopsidedly in the direction of the state's own citizens. Speaking of the military's weapons, not always, but most certainly sometimes, including the most lethal, such as bombs and missiles. But in some cases, such as Syria, these heaviest of the weapons are also used almost exclusively against its own people. Of course, this is implicitly recognized in theory by the EU with its programs directed at so-called civil society, individuals, groups, and organizations. But de facto, this is never the case. In order to affirm its importance, the EU is almost entirely interested in state-to-state relations, even as in the case of the Palestinian Authority, about which more later. One is dealing with very much of a non-state, speaking of actual sovereignty. Needless to say, the Middle Eastern peoples are attracted to Europe as an economic magnet, primarily, but also as a place with social advantages and political freedoms, generally scarce for them back home. As noted above, Europe's three sets of priorities are in controlling immigration, the famous Schengen visa, security, and investment, i.e. the free movement of European capital into the countries of the Middle East. On this, one might presume that there is agreement between the parties, European and Middle Eastern. Of course, the barrier here is constituted by the regimes in place. No longer questions for the people of the Middle East, nor for that matter, the peoples of Europe. These regimes have their own considerations in allotting priorities in the area of investment. Since they are by and large kleptocracies, i.e. the rulers are interested first and foremost in benefiting themselves, their families, and their political supporters. The rulers will allow capital in under favorable conditions for themselves as persons. And this is not necessarily to the liking of the European, be they states or investors. Meantime, discourse on the European side, as opposed to policies, is heavily democracy and human rights oriented. This is on the face of it a good thing, since it is what Middle Eastern peoples most need from their authoritarian governments. But the actual behavior of individual European states fundamentally undermines this enlightened rhetoric. France, Germany, Austria, Belgium, and so on to various degrees with their arms sales ignore human rights violations in the Middle Eastern countries, even egregious and massive ones. Let us recall how the French Interior Minister offered advice and help to President Ben Ali in the face of the Tunisian Revolution. They do so through massive arms and high technology deals, which inevitably entrench the power of dictators, the outstanding case in point being Marshal Sisi of Egypt, as well as the Gulf monarchies and other Arab states. And so we have this unstable balance between four parties, four entities, namely Middle Eastern regimes, the EU, European states, and Middle Eastern peoples, until a new structural transformation comes along and radically upends it, this unstable balance, as in 2011, perhaps this time with longer lasting effect. Europe is criticized, and rightly so, by the peoples of the Middle East, and Europe's divisions, north, south, east, west, are deplored. But there is widespread agreement regarding the necessity of continuing to cultivate relations at the dual popular and state levels. To quote Voltaire about another burning question, that, quote, if Europe didn't exist, it would have to be invented, if for no other reason than maintaining a kind of imaginary balance in global power relations. Now let us take a case study of Palestine. The European Commission supported the Madrid process from 1991, including finally the Oslo Accords of 1993, 94, 95, and chose to use the transition to adopt an activist approach in the face of Israeli disapproval. So Mr. Thomas Duplat del Moral, a relatively young civil service in the commission, opened an office in the American Colony Hotel in East Jerusalem. He supported European pro-Palestinian as well as indigenous Palestinian NGOs heavily, and thus made a considerable contribution to bottom-up democratic practice and theory for that matter. Mr. Duplat saw to it that Europe contributed to and protected conferences as well as economic, social, and political reform projects. The civil society role was important, even as social and economic activism was encouraged, along with long-standing political activism. The PLO was accepted and considered an actor, but not above, but within the social network and emerging political system. But Duplat and the Commission, that is to say the European community, the EU was not yet a reality. As soon as with Oslo, Israel recognized the PLO as representative of the Palestinian people, stopped all support to the popular sector, and switched to running projects exclusively through the PLO, and afterwards the Palestinian National Authority. This was a terrible and unnecessary mistake, destructive of the emerging, strong, active, and politically participant popular social civil sector, handing the virtual monopoly to the PNA. And the Palestinian Authority quickly set up an interior ministry and a ministry of information run by the same individual for a long time, which began instantly to repress political adversaries and moved to place strict controls on the non-state sector. In my estimation, the democratic development was quickly arrested, nipped in the bud until today. And the EU, which had a lifetime chance of further encouraging democracy in Palestine, withdrew its support and thus played a fundamental role, negatively at least, in the emergence of an authoritarian system, still flourishing today and more than ever. It later, but too late, reversed some of its practices and worked with non-governmental organizations and civil society at large. But the damage done is difficult, if not impossible, to undo. In the meantime, the disillusionment that has set in the global South, and especially the Middle East, is regrettable, given that the foreign policy apparatus of the EU has steadily strengthened and been gifted with an institutional arm, the European External Action Service, its foreign ministry. And one should note that this branch of the Union is until now led by social democrats, i.e. the center-left, whereas domestic policy and overall leadership remains firmly in the hands of the center-right European People's Party for the European Commission, and the European Council is in the hands of the centrist so-called liberals. This center-left foreign policy apparatus has always been more supportive of Palestine and other progressive causes around the world, and notably in the South. And the foreign policy chiefs themselves have, with some exceptions, come from the European South, most notably Italy and Spain, currently Spain, which understand and sympathize with struggling peoples, including the Palestinians. And so more recently, in 2019, the EU supported the holding of elections in the West Bank, Jerusalem and Gaza. And it had a strategy for making that possible, despite Israel and Premier Netanyahu's unwillingness, which was itself not necessarily so strong. So there was a good chance of the strategy succeeding. It seemed the Netanyahu government had possibly agreed. The supposed problem was making it possible for Jerusalem Palestinians to vote. This could have happened in the EU Jerusalem headquarters, in post offices, by mail, etc. And the EU firmly supported it, believing then that the Palestinian National Authority was serious about elections. Of course, it was not serious about them because opinion polls showed decisively that the ruling faction within the Fatah Party and President Mahmoud Abbas would lose. The latter, of course, in the presidential poll, would lose to Marwan Barghouti. And in the legislative elections, the fraction of Fatah supporting Abu Mazen would lose. The excuse for not holding the elections was that Palestinians couldn't vote in Jerusalem. This wasn't true, as explained above. And so the reason whispered to its interlocutors by the Palestinian National Authority was that Hamas was likely to win. And this is something that no one in Europe or elsewhere could accept. This was believed to a certain extent, even by some fearful Palestinian elite, but apparently not for once by the European Union. The facts are shown to have been very different. A combination of lists would have carried the day, of which Hamas was only one, forcing Abu Mazen's faction of Fatah into the opposition and him off of the stage entirely. Of course, this was unacceptable to the PA. Now the EU cannot be held responsible for the failure of the election to be held. They did their best. But the seeds planted in the mid-1990s, during the days of Duplat, made such a development inevitable. The choice of a top-down over a bottom-up strategy was fatal to Palestinian democracy, since the new Palestinian Authority never looked back and secured its monopoly on power. Currently, the EU is taken up by Ukraine and COVID. It shows an interest in Africa and rejects human rights violations when they are too egregious, as in Syria. But Palestine and much of the Middle East are completely absent. We will see when the current international political and medical crises are resolved, if ever. But with Britain out and the US, the continued reticence on the part of the US to become involved, not just Trump, but also Biden, inevitably European foreign policy will become more pronounced, and some of its battles it could win. Whereas the Middle Eastern regimes are too deeply ensconced in their brutal authoritarianism for democracy promotion to have much effect in the larger political sphere, certain collective struggles, such as that in Palestine, could find support, significant and potentially effective. How this works out remains to be seen, but hope should never be abandoned. On the other hand, the EU is always in a state of flux. Naturally enough, this is based partly on the differences existing among 27 states in foreign policy questions, especially regarding the Middle East in general, Palestine in particular. Eastern Europe, as mentioned before, for one, is firmly in the pro-Israel camp. But one shouldn't either underestimate the role of individuals. Remember the rather effective activism of Federica Mogherini and organizations. Here, the European External Action Service in the framing and implementation of foreign policy objectives. In conclusion, Europe's long history has a past and also a future just as long. Thank you very much.